Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. So as you will have already seen from the thumbnail, today's video is how I sewed up this little number. So this is super quick, really straightforward, really basically finished. So if you're interested in seeing how I sewed it up, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a velvet. It has stretch in both directions and it's in this gorgeous wine colour. And on to the cutting out. This is my front. I have one layer of that fabric underneath this pattern piece, and then I have 3 darts and a wrap to mark. So starting with the wrap, I have a line on each side that I'm cutting into. I have a little dot just at the bottom of the line and I'm stopping just about 1 millimeter or 2 shy of that dot. So that's the wrap marked. Now for my pleats. So just marking these in the same way as I would mark a dart. You guys have seen me do this many times. So just popping in a snip at each of those pleat legs. So that's the bottom of the pleats marked. Now for the top, which I've indicated on my pattern with dots, which I'm marking initially with a pin. So that's those all done. And now to replace those pins with a chalk mark. So that's all of my chalk marks in place. So now that that's done, I can remove my pattern piece and finish marking those pleats. So lining my ruler up with the notch and the dot, drawing myself a line, doing the same thing for all of my pleat legs. So that's those done. Ready to pin. In through one dot, out through the other. That's the top pinned. Then lining up the notches at the bottom, making sure my chalk lines are lined up and pinning. So that's the first one done. And of course I do exactly the same to the other two. That's how they look. And ready to stitch. Starting at the dot, back stitching, stitching the whole way along that chalk line and back stitching at the notch. So that's one done. And of course I do exactly the same to the other two, which you can see here. I've given them a press, and now to secure these in place. This will just make the next steps a little bit easier. So just lining up my edges and pinning. So that's that done. And here, just running a tacking stitch right along that edge. I'm stitching within my seam allowance, back stitching to start and to finish. So that's my pleats all stitched and held in place, and this is how that looks. Love this. So now that that's done, I can move on to the wrap. So just laying one side over the other, right sides together, making sure those edges are all nicely lined up and pinning, and ready to stitch. So starting right at the bottom of that cut you seen me place earlier, back stitching the whole way up to the top and back stitching to finish. So now just to turn my wrap right side out, and you can start to see here just how the front of this dress is going to look. I love it. So I want to join my wrap to my side seam in a second. And in order to make that step a little bit easier, I just want to join these two pieces of fabric together, just along that edge. So pinning into place and tacking. So stitching within my seam allowance, back stitching to start and to end. So that's that done. Before I can join this to the side seam though, I need to just join up those two raw edges. So just pushing my wrap out of the way, lining up one side over the other so that my fabric is right sides together and pinning and ready to tack on the sewing machine before sewing permanently on the overlocker. Starting at the side seam with a back stitch, sewing within my seam allowance the whole way down, making sure my last stitch is right on the edge of that cut. That's just going to make sure that I've got a really smooth and crisp corner there, so you can see that here. So happy with that. So that's that all tacked together. So now to sew it permanently. I'm adding a little bit of clear elastic in this seam, and what this is supposed to do is allow the fabric to stretch out, but more importantly for it to recover back to its original shape. So just lining that clear elastic up with that stitch line you've just seen me sew and stitching directly over the top. So that's how that looks. And after a bit of a press, nice and neat and tidy. So now that that's done, I'm ready to attach my wrap at the side seam. So just laying my wrap over the top of the seam I've just sewn, making sure my edges are all lined up, and pinning. And ready to tack into place. Stitching here again within my seam allowance, backstitching to start and backstitching to finish. So that's that done. So that's the front of this dress almost complete. I've got my pleats in, got my wrap in, got it all attached at the side seam. So now to work on the neck. So I'm adding a little bit of stretch tape here. This will just help prevent the neckline from stretching out too much. So just lining it up with the edge of the neck and pressing into place, trimming off any excess. So that's that done. And now for the front of this dress, I've decided on a facing. I have one layer of fabric underneath this pattern piece. So that's that all cut out. And off camera, I've just finished that outer edge on the overlocker just to tidy it up. And here, just lining it up with the neckline of my dress, right sides together, and pinning into place. Ready to stitch. Backstitching to start, sewing at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. I have a little pivot just at the corner of my neck and up the other side. Backstitching to finish. So that's that done. So I just need to trim down that seam allowance. So I'm taking away about 2/3 of that seam allowance, popping a little snip while I'm at it at the V. That will just ensure that when I turn this right side out, I'll have a nice sharp point there. So that's that done. So now I want to understitch the facing. So in preparation for that, I want to press it away from my dress front, but make sure that that trim seam allowance is butted up against the facing, so you can see that here, and ready to understitch. So stitching through the facing, through that trim seam allowance in underneath, and I'm about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the seam you've just seen me sew. Little pivot at my V, and back up the other side. Backstitching to start and to finish. So that's that done. So happy with that. So off camera, I'll give that a press, and this is how it looks. So that's my front complete, ready to be joined to my back at the shoulder. And speaking of my back, I have 2 layers of fabric underneath this pattern piece. So that's that done. And off camera, I've just ran the edges of the centre back seam through the overlocker from the neck the whole way down to the split. So now that that's done, I can join these 2 pieces. So just laying one over the other, right sides together, and pinning, and ready to stitch. Backstitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, the whole way down from the neck to the top of the split. Backstitching to finish, so that's my centre back seam all sewn up. And off camera, I've given that a good press, including the split at the bottom, so you can see that here. And while I was there, I've just added some of that stabilising tape you see me use on the front to the back neck. And to close up the neckline here, I've decided on a bias finish. So I've just cut myself a strip of the outer fabric. It's about 1 inch or so wide, and I'm just lining one end of it up, right sides together with one side of the neck, pinning, and ready to stitch. backstitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way around, taking it nice and gently here and backstitching to finish. So that's that done. And off camera I'll just trim down that seam allowance, press the bias away from the dress in preparation for understitching, just like I did on the front. So I'm stitching through the bias, through the trim seam allowance in underneath, backstitching to start, again taking it nice and easy here and backstitching to finish. So that's that done. So now I just need to take care of that raw edge. So I'm just going to fold the bias towards the dress this time, making sure I can see those stitches that I've just sewn, tucking that raw edge in underneath and pressing into place. Pinning. And I'll finish that off camera. This is how it looks. And ready to stitch. Backstitching to start, and this time I'm stitching as close as I can get to that inner crease, trying to stick to that as close as I can the whole way around. Backstitching to finish. So that's that done. So happy with that. And off camera I'll just trim off that excess bias and give the whole thing a good press, which you can see I've done here. And now this piece is ready to be joined to the front at the shoulder. So just pulling my facing up out of the way, laying my back over my front, lining up those shoulder seams right sides together and pinning. And ready to tack this into place for now. Just like before, I'll sew this seam permanently on the overlocker in a second. Sewing within my seam allowance, being really careful when I get to the neck edge. I want to make sure I stop stitching there right where the back neck meets the front. That will ensure I get a really clean neckline. So that's that all tacked into place. So now I need to deal with the facing edge. So to keep everything all nice and neat and tidy, I'm just going to fold that facing back over the seam I've just sewn and pin into place. And stitch this time, as I said, on the overlocker from the edge of the neck the whole way across the shoulder seam. So that's that done. And now just to pull everything right side out. And here you can see just how nice and clean that back neck meets the front and the facing edge all neatly enclosed. Love this finish. So now that that's done, I'm ready to close up my side seams. So just laying my front over my back, lining up those seam edges and pinning, and ready to stitch. So to the overlocker, starting at the hem, the whole way up, over the waist, and finishing at the underarm. So that's how that looks, and I've given that a good press. And while I was at the overlocker, I've just finished off the hems of my sleeves, pressed them up by my hem allowance and pinned. I've done exactly the same on the hem of the dress, so around the edges through the overlocker, pressed and pinned. So now the very last thing I have to do is just run some hand stitching around those hems. So using a silk thread and a super fine needle, I'm just anchoring that thread at the corner, picking up a little bit of the fabric from the dress, at a diagonal down to the hem, little bit of the fabric back to the dress at a diagonal, and repeating. So that's how that looks. And I'll finish that off camera along with the sleeve hems. And this is how it looks. Nice and neat and tidy. And with that, this little dress is complete. So I have that bias finish around the back neck, that gorgeous facing nicely understitched on the front, my hand stitch sleeve hems, and those details around the bust and waist with the beautiful pleats and wrap. I absolutely love how this looks. And then of course that hand stitched hem at the bottom. Exactly the same thing on the back split, nicely hand stitched. And this is what it looks like on. So I absolutely adore this dress. I love the asymmetric shape of the neckline. I love those pleats and that little bit of a wrap. And I think this is one of those dresses that looks as if it's really complicated, but you've just seen this is super straightforward to put together. If you can sew a dart, you can sew this dress. It is super comfortable, and in this fabric I think very luxurious looking. And if you've been following along over on my Insta stories, you will have seen the inspiration for this one. Of course I had to change up the details a bit, but I love how my version has come out.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you guys in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!